The courtroom was cold, sterile, the kind of place where lives were decided with the stroke of a pen, the slam of a gavel. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, but they weren't loud enough to drown out the murmurs of anticipation in the air. A trial was underway, and though the defendant sat at the center of it, the real show was about to unfold between two people who weren't even supposed to be the main act. A young black man sat stiffly at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly together, his knuckles white from the pressure. He had been here before, not this exact courtroom, but places just like it, places where the odds were always stacked against people who looked like him. Accused of a crime he swore he didn't commit, he barely had a voice in the room. He had been through this system enough to know that sometimes, innocence didn't matter. What mattered was who had power. And today, power stood across from him in a pristine police uniform, chest puffed, arms crossed, a smug grin stretching across his face. The officer had seen this before. Another case, another defendant who would fight and plead, and for what? It was predictable. Inevitable. He had done this for years, his influence stretching far beyond the precinct, seeping into courtrooms, into rulings, into the quiet conversations held behind closed doors where justice was decided long before the first gavel hit. And today, he was feeling particularly amused. Because standing before him, ready to speak, was a black woman, well-dressed, composed, confident. He didn't know who she was, and he didn't care. To him, she was just another one of them. And that was enough. He chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as she began to speak, her voice calm, measured, controlled. "And you are," he interrupted, cutting her off before she could even introduce herself. His voice dripped with condescension, the kind reserved for people he didn't respect. His lawyer? His babysitter? Or just another loud black woman who thinks she knows the law? The room tensed. A silence thick enough to cut through settled over the courtroom. Even the judge, who had barely looked up from his papers, stole a glance. The defendant flinched, his shoulders tightening, jaw locking. The woman, however, did not move. Did not blink. Did not react in the way the officer expected. The officer grinned, amused by her silence, mistaking it for hesitation. He leaned forward slightly, voice dropping just enough to feel more personal, more cutting. "You people always act like you know the system, like you can beat it. But let me tell you something, you don't. You never do. Because the law." He tapped his badge with 2 fingers, slow, deliberate. "The law is on our side." A low murmur rippled through the audience. A few exchanged glances, uncomfortable, but no one dared speak. This wasn't new. This wasn't shocking. It was just another day in the American justice system. But the woman did not flinch. Instead, she exhaled slowly, as if she had already anticipated this moment, as if she had heard these words before, as if this wasn't the first time she had been underestimated by a man in uniform who thought he held all the cards. She tilted her head slightly, studying him, as if she were memorizing his face, every detail of his arrogance, every ounce of misplaced confidence dripping from his smirk. And then, with the same slow precision, she reached into the inside pocket of her jacket. The officer's grin faltered. A badge. Not just any badge. An FBI badge. The courtroom was silent. Not the awkward, brief kind of silence that followed an uncomfortable exchange. This was the heavy, deafening kind of silence, the kind that sucked all the air from the room, that made time slow to a crawl. The officer's eyes darted to the emblem, then back to her face, and in that single moment, something shifted. Because he realized. He had just mocked the wrong black woman. The confidence in his stance wavered, his smug smirk twisting into something unreadable. The judge leaned forward slightly, eyebrows raised. The defendant turned in his seat, staring, his breath caught in his throat. The murmurs in the audience turned into hushed whispers. Because this was not what anyone had expected. The officer swallowed, but it was too late. She had already begun to speak. And what happened next would leave everyone in that courtroom shocked. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, injustice, and discrimination in all forms. This channel is a place where powerful stories unfold, but in real life, we believe in fairness, respect, and equality for all. To every black viewer watching this, know that you are valued, respected, and never alone in this fight. Now, get ready for a gripping story filled with twists, justice, and redemption. If you enjoy our content, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us for more incredible stories. Enjoy the story. The air inside the courtroom was thick with tension, the kind that pressed against the skin and settled deep in the chest. It wasn't just the case that had brought people here today, it was the unspoken weight of history, of power, of a system that had, for too long, bent in one direction. The walls were lined with rows of wooden benches, polished but worn, the kind that had seated decades of families watching the fate of their loved ones be decided. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale, almost sterile glow on the proceedings. A massive American flag hung behind the judge's bench, its presence both symbolic and ironic, depending on who was looking at it. At the defense table sat Jamal Carter, a 22-year-old black man with deep brown skin and sharp, intelligent eyes that had seen more than they should have at his age. He was dressed in a navy blue suit that didn't quite fit, borrowed, most likely, the shoulders too wide, the sleeves just a little too short. His hands were clasped together tightly, his fingers interlocked, the tips pressing into his skin hard enough to turn his knuckles white. He wasn't guilty, but that had never been enough. He knew that. Everyone who looked like him knew that. He had learned it the first time he was stopped by the police at 14-4, looking suspicious, in his own neighborhood. He had learned it again at 16 when a security guard followed him around a department store even though he had money in his pocket and no intention of stealing. And now, at 22, he was learning it on the grandest scale of all, sitting in a courtroom, accused of a crime he didn't commit, watching his fate dangle above him like a guillotine, waiting for the final drop. Across the room, standing with the ease of a man who had never questioned his own authority, was Officer Darren Calloway. Mid-40s, tall, broad shoulders, buzzed blonde hair with just enough gray at the temples to give him an air of experience. His uniform was crisp, the fabric barely wrinkling as he crossed his arms over his chest, exuding the kind of confidence that came from years of getting away with exactly what he was doing now. Darren wasn't just a cop. He was the cop, the one everyone at the precinct knew had a reputation but was untouchable. He had friends in high places. He had judges who owed him favors. He had fellow officers who would cover for him without question. And most of all, he had a system that had never once told him no. Darren's eyes flicked to Jamal, and the smirk that curled at the corner of his mouth was barely contained. Another kid, another case, another victory. This wasn't about justice. This was about power. And he knew, with every fiber of his being, that he held all of it. Then, there was Maya Thompson. She sat in the gallery, composed, back straight, eyes sharp, watching every movement, every shift in tone, every flicker of expression that crossed Darren Calloway's face. Her presence was calculated, she hadn't stepped into this room without knowing exactly what she was walking into. She was dressed in a charcoal gray suit, her dark brown skin smooth, her hair styled into neat braids that framed her face. To anyone who didn't know better, she looked like just another concerned citizen, maybe a public defender, maybe an activist who had come to support yet another black man being railroaded by the system. But Maya was none of those things. She had spent years understanding men like Darren Calloway. Years studying the way they operated, the way they manipulated, the way they twisted the law to serve them while pretending to uphold it. She had spent nights poring over case files, pulling at threads, following the patterns, watching as name after name of black men came across her desk, all tied back to the same precinct, the same officers, the same abuse of power. And every time, one name came up more than any other, Darren Calloway. Maya knew exactly who he was. But he had no idea who she was. The case against Jamal was flimsy at best, built on circumstantial evidence and the word of a police officer whose testimony had somehow never been questioned in a court of law. The accusation? Armed robbery. A convenience store hit late at night, the clerk rattled, the security footage grainy. The suspect? A black male, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing a dark hoodie. No clear face, no fingerprints, no DNA. Just a description vague enough to fit 100 men in the city. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that Darren Calloway had made the arrest, and that alone was enough for the prosecution to push forward. Jamal had been at home that night, his alibi solid, except that the only witness who could verify it was his mother, and to the court, that was never enough. The defense attorney had done his best, had argued that there was no real evidence, no real case, but the prosecution was relentless. Because in this system, a black man's innocence was never assumed, it had to be proven beyond doubt. And even then, sometimes, it wasn't enough. The judge, an older white man who had presided over cases like this for decades, barely looked up as the proceedings moved forward. His face was unreadable, his expression indifferent, as if he had already made up his mind long before today. The jury sat in their box, a mix of faces, some watching with mild interest, others glancing away as if they didn't want to be the ones to decide something that carried so much weight. And then, there was Darren Calloway, standing there with the same cocky arrogance he always had, answering the prosecutor's questions with the ease of a man who had told 100 different versions of the same story and had never been doubted once. It was Maya's turn to speak. She rose from her seat, moving with deliberate precision as she stepped forward. Darren's eyes flicked to her, and for a split second, something flashed across his face, curiosity, mild annoyance, maybe even amusement. Another black woman stepping in, thinking she could change something. He had seen it before. He knew how this would go. And then he smirked. So, what are you? His lawyer? His babysitter? Or just another loud black woman who thinks she runs the place? His voice dripped with condescension, the corners of his lips twitching as if he was holding back a chuckle. Maya didn't react. She didn't flinch. She didn't give him the satisfaction of even blinking. Instead, she let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of his words to settle in the room. Darren leaned back slightly, shaking his head. You people always act like you know the law. But let me tell you something, you don't. And then Maya moved. Slow. Deliberate. Reaching into her jacket, pulling out something small, metallic, shining under the courtroom lights. A badge. An FBI badge. Darren's smirk vanished. His body stiffened. His breathing hitched, just for a fraction of a second, but Maya saw it. She saw everything. Because at that moment, Darren Calloway understood. He had just humiliated the wrong woman. And he had no idea what was coming next. In the charged aftermath of that unforgettable moment, the courtroom's atmosphere shifted imperceptibly but inexorably, as if time itself had hesitated in recognition of what was to come. The revelation of the badge, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, had left everyone reeling, each person in the room processing the implications in their own way. As murmurs grew into a low, indistinct hum of disbelief and indignation, the prosecutor's confident tone faltered for just a heartbeat, and even the judge's measured gaze took on a glimmer of surprise before returning to stoic professionalism. In that suspended moment, the stage was set for an unfolding drama where every spoken word and every silent glance carried the weight of future reckonings. The tension in the room was palpable as voices began to rise in heated, urgent exchanges. Jamal Carter, whose eyes had been downcast moments before, now shone with a mix of defiant hope and quiet determination, his internal resolve hardening in the face of an unjust system that had yet again sought to silence him. Though he remained a silent figure on the defense table, his presence commanded attention through the raw emotion radiating from him, a yearning for truth and a desperate need for vindication that resonated deeply with every observer present. Across the aisle, Officer Darren Calloway's previously unassailable arrogance began to crumble. His smooth, practiced responses gave way to stammered justifications and evasive glances that betrayed a growing anxiety. I was just following orders, he managed to blurt out in a strained, unconvincing tone when pressed by the prosecutor, his voice trembling as if caught between the familiar rhythm of power and the sudden awareness of his own vulnerability. Meanwhile, Maya Thompson's composed demeanor remained unyielding, though her eyes burned with a quiet intensity that spoke of countless battles fought and won against the creeping forces of injustice. In hushed yet impassioned undertones, whispers of her past efforts to dismantle the very system that Darren had so relentlessly upheld began to circulate among those in the gallery. Her reputation as a relentless seeker of truth was spreading like wildfire, igniting a spark of hope among the disenfranchised and a simmering dread among those who had thrived on corruption and prejudice. As the proceedings resumed, the defense attorney rose to speak with a measured cadence that belied the urgency of the moment, meticulously outlining the inconsistencies in the prosecution's case and hinting at evidence that had been quietly gathered over months of covert investigation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying both authority and a deep-seated empathy for the wronged, "we are not here merely to settle a legal dispute, we are here to confront a long-standing injustice that has scarred our community for far too long." His words resonated with the audience, drawing nods of agreement from those who had suffered similar indignities, while drawing scowls of disdain from others who clung to the vestiges of an outdated order. In the midst of these verbal sparrings, internal dialogues between the characters unfolded silently, their expressions and fleeting glances conveying volumes that no scripted speech could capture. Jamal's eyes, reflecting both fear and determination, met those of Maya, an unspoken understanding passing between them, a mutual acknowledgement of the stakes at hand, a promise that every injustice, every slight, would not go unchallenged. "We must hold them accountable," someone in the gallery murmured, the sentiment rippling through the crowd like an incantation for change, while in a quieter corner, another voice, laden with bitter irony, commented, "The day of reckoning is coming, and today might just be its harbinger." Even as the defense attorney continued his impassioned plea, the prosecuting team, desperate to salvage their crumbling case, began to weave their own narrative, one that painted Jamal as a dangerous liability and tried to distract the jury from the glaring holes in their evidence. "Your Honor," one of the prosecution's lawyers interjected with a strained smile that could not mask the underlying desperation, "this case is not just about one man's freedom, it is about maintaining the order that keeps our society safe." His words, delivered with rehearsed certainty, fell flat against the rising tide of public sentiment and the quiet, unyielding resolve in Maya's eyes. The dialogue in the courtroom escalated, growing more impassioned with every passing moment. Darren, once so confident in his ability to control the narrative, now found himself on the defensive as colleagues whispered in the corridors, evidence of his own misconduct being unearthed by persistent investigators who refused to be silenced by his position or his past deeds. "You're not untouchable anymore," a voice echoed from somewhere in the back, a challenge that reverberated with the force of long-suppressed anger. Every word uttered in that fraught atmosphere was a reminder of the countless injustices that had been brushed aside for too long, a clarion call that the time for change was now. Outside the courtroom, the city itself seemed to pulse with anticipation, its streets alive with conversations and speculation about the day's dramatic events, each passerby wondering if this would be the moment when the scales of justice would finally tip in favor of those who had been trampled upon. In homes, on social media, and in hushed gatherings in local diners, people spoke of Jamal's plight and Darren's hubris with fervor, each retelling adding layers to the collective narrative of retribution and redemption. "This is the spark that will ignite a movement," one community leader declared to a group of attentive neighbors, while another argued, "It's only a matter of time before every crooked system meets its match." The rising tension, carefully nurtured within the courtroom, bled into every facet of public life, transforming individual grievances into a shared battle against a legacy of prejudice and abuse of power. Amid this swirling cauldron of anticipation, Maya continued to hold her ground, her measured responses and incisive observations gradually eroding the facade of control that Darren had once wielded so effortlessly. "The truth has a way of emerging," she remarked quietly to a fellow advocate during a brief recess, her tone both reassuring and ominous, hinting at the inexorable force of justice that was gathering momentum. As the session drew to a close, the defense attorney's final remarks hung in the air like a challenge, a dare to the powers that be to finally acknowledge the suffering inflicted upon an entire community. The jury retreated to deliberate, their faces a tapestry of conflict, torn between long-held biases and the undeniable evidence of systemic wrongdoing. In the silence that followed, as the courtroom emptied and the echo of fervent debates lingered in the corridors, every participant was left with a single, burning question: what would be the price of accountability, and how far would the forces of corruption go to protect their secrets? The stage was meticulously set, each character a living testament to a struggle that was both personal and universal, their fates intertwined in a narrative that promised not just a legal verdict but a reckoning that would shake the very foundations of their world. And so, as dusk settled over the city and the final light of day waned into darkness, a palpable sense of foreboding mixed with hope took hold, a promise that the forthcoming climax would not only reveal the hidden depths of human frailty and strength but would also forever alter the course of lives defined by injustice and defiance, leaving every onlooker to wonder, in the silent moments before the storm, if this was indeed the beginning of a transformative chapter in the relentless pursuit of truth and justice. The room had never been this silent. Not even during the judge's opening statements, not even when Darren Calloway had first stepped onto the stand with his usual arrogance, the weight of years of unchecked power behind him. But now, silence filled every corner of the courtroom, wrapping itself around the walls like a suffocating force. Everyone was watching, jurors, spectators, even the judge, who had spent the better part of his career feigning indifference. But no one in that room was indifferent now. Darren stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. His jaw clenched, and his grip on the wooden railing of the witness stand tightened, his knuckles turning white. The weight of realization settled into his features, realization and something else, something close to panic. He had spent years in control of this narrative, years bending the system to his will, manipulating evidence, walking free from accusations that should have ended his career long ago. But now, all of that was unraveling, and it was happening faster than he could process. Maya Thompson remained where she was, standing tall, unwavering. The FBI badge in her hand was no longer the focal point, it had already done its job, already shifted the balance of power in the room. Now, it was about what came next. And what came next was the truth. "You really thought this was just another case, didn't you, Officer Calloway?" Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a quiet intensity that made every word hit harder. Another black man accused of a crime he didn't commit. Another easy conviction. Another day of you getting away with it. Darren exhaled sharply, forcing a smirk that was meant to look dismissive but only succeeded in making him look desperate. "I don't know what the hell you think you're doing, but you planted evidence," Maya interrupted, her words slicing through his defense like a blade. "You falsified police reports. You coerced witnesses. You lied under oath, again and again. And you did it because you thought no one was paying attention." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, the kind of murmur that was dangerous, that signaled a shift in control. Darren's eyes flickered to the jury, to the gallery, to the judge, searching for an ally, for some sign that the system would still protect him. But no one moved. No one spoke. "You have no proof," he spat, his voice lower now, as if trying to regain some semblance of power. "This is nothing but a witch hunt. A setup." Maya took a step closer, her presence looming over him, unshaken. "That's the thing, Darren. We do have proof. Months of it. Years of it. Testimonies. Video footage. Paper trails leading right back to you." She turned toward the prosecution table, nodding slightly, and within seconds, a large screen flickered to life. The first video played. A grainy, black and white security camera feed. A dark alleyway. Darren's face, unmistakable, captured under the glow of a street lamp. His voice, clear despite the static, threatening a terrified young man into taking a plea deal for a crime he hadn't committed. Then another video. A traffic stop, body cam footage that had somehow never made it into official reports. Darren's voice again, colder this time, as he ordered a man out of his car, searched him without cause, then discovered drugs that weren't there moments before. Another video. A police station interrogation room. Darren speaking to a rookie cop, coaching him on how to tweak his statement to ensure a conviction. Clip after clip, each one damning, each one more shocking than the last. The air in the room grew heavier with every passing second, the weight of Darren's crimes finally laid bare for all to see. His face had drained of color, his breathing uneven. For the first time in his career, he had nowhere to run. The judge cleared his throat, his voice measured but tense. "Officer Calloway, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Darren hesitated. There was no confident smirk now, no arrogance, no bluster. Just silence. Maya didn't wait. "You're done," she said simply, her voice carrying across the room. "The badge you've been hiding behind won't save you. The people who've covered for you, they're done protecting you. And the system that's let you get away with this for so long, it's finally caught up." The weight of those words settled over him like a death sentence. The jury's expressions were unreadable, but the energy in the room had shifted. The once untouchable officer was now just another man, stripped of his invincibility, his crimes exposed for all to see. Jamal Carter sat at the defense table, his eyes locked onto Darren's, the roles suddenly reversed. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one being judged. He wasn't the one with his life hanging in the balance. Darren had stolen years from men like him, stolen their freedom, their dignity. But today, it was Darren Calloway who had everything to lose. The silence stretched again, and then, finally, Darren spoke. "This is a setup," he muttered, barely above a whisper, but the words held no conviction. "No wait." Maya shook her head. "No, Darren. This is justice." And just like that, the gavel slammed down. The room erupted into motion, gasps, murmurs, whispers of disbelief. Officers in the back of the room stepped forward, and before Darren could say another word, before he could reach for some last-ditch attempt at escape, the cuffs were snapped onto his wrists. The click of metal against metal echoed through the space, final and absolute. Jamal exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for years. He wasn't free yet, not officially, but for the first time since he had been dragged into this nightmare, it felt like justice wasn't just an abstract concept, it was real, it was tangible, and it was happening. Darren struggled, tried to twist away, but the hands on his arms held firm. The same system he had manipulated for so long was now swallowing him whole, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As he was led away, his eyes darted back to Maya, and for a brief moment, something flickered in his gaze, fear. Maya didn't look away. She let him see it, let him feel it, let him know that this was only the beginning. Because justice had finally arrived. And for the first time in his life, Darren Calloway was on the wrong side of it. The gavel's final strike echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, reverberating in the chests of everyone present. A single sound, yet it carried the weight of everything that had led to this moment, the lies, the betrayals, the unchecked power that had finally been ripped from Darren Calloway's hands. The air felt electric, like the seconds before a thunderstorm, charged with something undeniable, something inevitable. Darren's body tensed as the cold steel of the handcuffs bit into his wrists, his breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts. His mind raced, scrambling for an escape, some last shred of control to grasp onto, but there was nothing. The walls that had once protected him were gone, and all that remained was the crushing reality that his reign was over. Maya Thompson stood motionless, her gaze steady, unshaken. She watched as Darren's expression twisted from disbelief to anger, then something else, something closer to fear. It was a rare sight to see a man who had spent years believing he was untouchable now reduced to nothing more than a prisoner, shackled like the very people he had oppressed. His jaw clenched, the veins in his neck pulsing as he tried to summon the bravado he had always worn like armor, but it was crumbling. The courtroom was no longer his playground. "This is bullshit," Darren spat, his voice hoarse, desperate. He turned to the judge, then to the prosecution, then anywhere he could, eyes darting as if searching for someone to save him. "You all know me. You know what I've done for this city. I kept the streets clean, I put criminals away, you framed innocent men," Maya cut in, her tone razor sharp, slicing through his protests before they could take root. "You planted evidence. You destroyed lives. You stole years from people who didn't deserve it, and for what? To feed your own power? To fuel your own ego?" Darren's nostrils flared as his eyes snapped to hers, dark with resentment, but there was something else lurking beneath it, panic. His breath hitched as he tried to regain footing in a battle he had already lost. "You don't understand," he hissed, his voice lower now, edged with something dangerously close to pleading. "You think you're the hero here, but you don't know what it takes to keep the streets safe. You don't know the kind of scum I've taken off the streets." Maya took a step closer, her presence an unyielding force. "You mean the black men you targeted? The ones you threw into a broken system because you knew it would chew them up without question? The ones you made criminals when they were nothing but kids?" "Oh, I understand just fine, Officer Calloway." Her voice was steady, but there was fire beneath it, a righteous fury that simmered just beneath the surface. "And now, you're going to understand what it feels like to have the system turn on you." Darren swallowed hard, the muscles in his throat working, but he had no words. He turned to the judge, his voice rising again, frantic now. "Your Honor, this is insane. You can't seriously believe this. Look at her. She's trying to tear down the whole department. This is a political move, a witch hunt. You did this to yourself," the judge interrupted, his tone final, carrying no room for argument. He sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose before speaking again. "Officer Calloway, given the overwhelming evidence against you, and the numerous testimonies implicating you in misconduct, corruption, and perjury, you are hereby remanded into federal custody pending further trial. The extent of your charges will be determined, but make no mistake, this court does not take abuses of power lightly." Darren's body jerked as if the words had physically struck him. His face twisted, his eyes darting wildly now, desperate for someone to intervene, someone to save him. But no one spoke. The room held its breath, watching him unravel, watching him drown in the consequences of his own making. Jamal Carter, who had sat through the entire ordeal in silent disbelief, finally let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His hands trembled slightly, his fingers gripping the edge of the table as reality settled over him. He had spent months preparing for the worst, convincing himself that the truth wouldn't matter, that men like Darren Calloway didn't lose, not in places like this. And yet, here he was, watching the man who had tried to steal his future being led away in cuffs. Darren turned suddenly, locking eyes with Jamal, and for the first time, there was no mockery in his gaze. No smugness. Just pure, undiluted hatred. "You think this changes anything?" His voice was lower now, venomous, each word dripping with the last dregs of his pride. "You think you won?" Jamal's expression didn't change. He didn't flinch. He didn't smile. He simply held Darren's gaze, letting him see the truth written in his face. "I didn't win," he said finally, his voice steady, unwavering. "Justice did." Maya watched the exchange in silence, something shifting in her chest. For all the trials, for all the evidence, for all the years spent fighting against men like Darren, she had never seen one fall this hard. And yet, there was no satisfaction in it, only the weight of knowing how many more like him were still out there. Darren Calloway was just one man. One battle. But the war was far from over. As Darren was led toward the exit, the cameras in the room flashed wildly, the outside world already devouring the moment, already turning it into something more. Headlines would be written, news segments would air, debates would rage. And for once, the people who had suffered under men like Darren wouldn't just be statistics, wouldn't just be another name buried in a court file. The world would see. The world would know. Jamal turned to Maya, his expression unreadable for a moment before he finally spoke. What happens now? Maya exhaled slowly, glancing at the courtroom full of people still murmuring, still processing the gravity of what had just happened. Then she looked back at him, her lips pressing together in a firm line before she finally answered. Now. She straightened her shoulders, adjusting the badge clip to her belt, the weight of it heavier than ever. Now we make sure this never happens again. The doors to the courtroom swung open, and the world outside was waiting. The courtroom had emptied out slowly, the echoes of shuffling feet and hushed conversations lingering like ghosts in the vast, wooden-paneled space. The energy had shifted, the weight of what had transpired still pressing into the air, heavy and unrelenting. Darren Calloway was gone, dragged out in handcuffs, his face drained of the smug confidence he had worn like a second skin. The cameras had followed him down the hallway, capturing his stiff movements, his clenched jaw, the desperate way his eyes flickered toward any lingering presence of authority that might still be on his side. But there had been no saviors waiting for him. No whispered reassurances. No quiet promises that things would be swept under the rug. The system he had exploited for so long had finally turned its back on him. Jamal Carter remained seated at the defense table, his fingers running absently over the grain of the polished wood. He could still feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, the aftershocks of fear, anger, disbelief, and something else, something dangerously close to relief. It didn't feel real yet. It didn't feel final. His entire life, he had learned to expect the worst, to prepare for disappointment, to anticipate the ways the world would twist itself to make sure justice was never fully served. He had spent months bracing for the inevitable, for the judge's words to be another confirmation of what he already knew, that the system was not built for men like him to walk free. But now, the man responsible for stealing so many years from innocent people was the one facing consequences. The weight of that truth pressed down on him, unfamiliar, almost suffocating in its magnitude. Maya stood a few feet away, arms crossed, her posture unreadable. She had seen moments like this before, victories that didn't feel like victories because they took too long to arrive, because they came at a cost too steep to measure. She had spent her entire career chasing men like Darren Calloway, unraveling their carefully woven lies, exposing their corruption piece by piece. And yet, standing here now, watching the aftermath unfold, she felt something gnawing at the back of her mind, something restless, something unfinished. She exhaled slowly before speaking. "You did it," she said, her voice measured, yet softer than before. Jamal's lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze still unfocused. "Did I?" His voice held no celebration, no triumph. Just exhaustion. Or did I just survive? Maya tilted her head slightly, studying him. Maybe both. A pause settled between them, stretching longer than either of them expected. Outside the courtroom doors, reporters were likely swarming, the story already spreading, headlines forming, talking heads debating what had happened today as if it were some political chess move rather than a real-life reckoning. Jamal's fingers drummed lightly against the table, his movements restless. What happens now? His voice carried the weight of uncertainty, of a man who had spent so much time preparing for a fight that he didn't know what to do with himself now that the battle had shifted. Maya's jaw tightened slightly before she answered. Calloway is facing federal charges. That means a whole separate investigation, grand jury hearings, trial. He won't just be gone, he'll be buried in this. He doesn't have the allies he used to have, and once one officer falls, the rest start looking for ways to save themselves. She let out a slow breath. There will be more. Jamal nodded, his mind turning over the words, absorbing the reality of it. The fall of one corrupt cop wasn't the end, it was just the beginning of something bigger. And you? His question was quiet, but pointed. Maya's expression didn't shift, but there was something unreadable behind her eyes. This case was personal, she admitted, the words carrying an edge of something deeper, something unspoken. But it's not the last one. Not even close. She let her arms drop to her sides, her posture loosening just slightly. Men like Calloway don't operate alone. They don't just wake up one day and decide to abuse their power, they're taught how to do it. They're protected when they do it. He's not the first. He won't be the last. Jamal studied her for a moment, his own exhaustion mirrored in the way she carried herself, steadfast, unshaken, but tired in a way that went beyond just today's events. He nodded slightly. Then I guess we both keep going. Another silence settled, but this one was different. Heavier. Not uncomfortable, but full of things neither of them had the energy to put into words. The courtroom doors swung open, and Jamal turned toward the sound. His mother was standing there, eyes glossy with unshed tears, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as if afraid to move, as if the spell would break and he would vanish from her sight. Jamal rose slowly, his body stiff from hours of sitting, from months of tension. As he took his first steps toward her, she met him halfway, her arms wrapping around him in a grip so tight it nearly took his breath away. "My baby," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My baby's coming home." Jamal closed his eyes, letting himself sink into the warmth, the safety of it. The relief. He hadn't dared to believe it before now, hadn't let himself imagine a life outside of this fight. But now, with her arms around him, with the weight of the courtroom fading into the background, it felt real. Behind them, Maya watched, her expression unreadable. There was no space for celebration in her mind, not yet. Not when there were more battles ahead. Not when she knew how easily this moment of justice could be forgotten, buried under the next case, the next victim, the next fight. But as she turned to leave, she caught one last look at Jamal, holding on to his mother like an anchor in a storm, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself the smallest flicker of hope. Justice had found its way here today. The question now was whether it would stay. The hallway outside the courtroom was a chaos of voices, flashes of camera lights, and hurried footsteps. The news had spread like wildfire. Reporters swarmed, their microphones thrust forward, their questions cutting through the air like daggers. The fall of Darren Calloway was more than just another legal proceeding, it was a seismic shift in a system that had for too long allowed men like him to operate unchecked. Jamal Carter stood just outside the doors, his mother's arms still wrapped tightly around his, as if afraid that if she let go, this would all disappear, that he would be taken from her again. He didn't blame her. The scars of this system weren't just on him, they were on her too, on every mother, every father, every sibling who had ever sat in a courtroom, fearing the worst. But today, the worst hadn't happened. Today, something impossible had taken place, justice had cracked through the surface of a system designed to deny it. Maya Thompson moved with precision through the hallway, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. She was used to moments like these, the flood of press, the urgent need for answers, the hunger in the air for a reaction, a quote, a soundbite. But she wasn't here for spectacle. She never had been. She had a job to do, and the battle wasn't over just because one corrupt cop had been taken down. A reporter stepped into her path, a woman with a sharp, professional tone, microphone already positioned. "Agent Thompson," she called out, her voice cutting through the clamor, "do you believe this case will open the floodgates for more officers to be investigated for misconduct? How deep does this corruption run?" Maya barely paused, her eyes locking onto the woman for a moment before answering. "This isn't about opening the floodgates," she said, her voice steady, deliberate. "It's about holding people accountable. Darren Calloway wasn't an isolated case. He was a symptom of a much larger disease. And if the system is finally willing to confront that, then this is just the beginning." The reporter tried to push further, but Maya was already moving. She had said what she needed to say. Jamal watched her go, something unreadable in his expression. He could feel the eyes on him too, the cameras capturing every movement, every shift of emotion on his face. He had never wanted to be a symbol. He had never asked for any of this. He just wanted to live, to exist without the constant shadow of fear pressing against his back. But now, he had become something bigger than himself. Whether he wanted it or not, his name was going to mean something beyond just another statistic in the system. His mother squeezed his arm gently. "You ready to go home?" Her voice was quiet, filled with something heavy, something raw. Jamal hesitated, not because he didn't want to go, God, he wanted to go more than anything, but because there was something unfinished here, something unresolved. His eyes followed Maya as she disappeared down the corridor, her presence still lingering even after she was gone. He exhaled sharply before answering. "Not yet." His mother's brow furrowed slightly. "Jamal," he turned to her, his expression softer now, but firm. I need to do something first." Her hesitation was brief. She had spent too long fighting for him, standing in spaces where she had no power, pleading for a justice that had so often denied her family. But she also knew her son. She knew that when he set his mind to something, he wouldn't walk away. Finally, she nodded. "Okay." Jamal moved through the hallway with purpose, his steps steady despite the chaos around him. He didn't stop for the reporters, didn't acknowledge the murmurs that followed him. He had one destination in mind. It didn't take long to find Darren. The holding area wasn't far, just past the secured courtroom offices, a place where defendants waited before being transferred to their next location. Jamal could see him through the narrow glass window, Darren sitting there, his hands still cuffed, his body rigid with tension. He wasn't the same man he had been in that courtroom. The arrogance had drained from his face, replaced with something quieter, something dangerously close to fear. Jamal stepped inside without hesitation. Darren looked up at the sound of the door, his gaze locking onto Jamal's, and for a brief moment, they just stared at each other. There were no cameras here. No press. No judge. Just them. Darren's jaw tightened, his shoulders squaring as if trying to reclaim some semblance of power. "What the hell do you want?" His voice was rough, but there was no weight behind it, no real threat. Jamal didn't blink. "I wanted to see you like this." Darren scoffed, shaking his head. "Yeah. Enjoying the show, Carter? Think this makes you better than me?" Jamal's expression didn't change. He took another step forward, closing the distance just enough to make sure his words wouldn't be lost in the empty space between them. "You don't get it, do you?" His voice was quiet, but steady, unwavering. "This isn't about being better than you. This isn't about revenge." Darren's lips curled slightly, but it wasn't a smile. "Then what is it about?" Jamal exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "It's about the fact that you're finally feeling what you made everyone else feel for years. The fear. The uncertainty. The helplessness. It's not about me watching you fall. It's about you realizing that you were never as untouchable as you thought." Darren's nostrils flared, his breathing growing heavier. "You think this changes anything? You think the system is suddenly on your side? You really think they give a damn about you?" Jamal's eyes darkened slightly, but he didn't rise to the bait. He had spent too much of his life carrying the weight of anger, letting it dictate his every move. But not now. Not here. "I don't need the system to be on my side," he said simply. "I just need it to stop destroying people like me." Darren opened his mouth, but no words came. Whatever he had planned to say, whatever rebuttal he had lined up, it died before it could leave his lips. Jamal let the silence stretch for a moment longer before taking a step back. He had seen enough. Darren Calloway wasn't some monster, he was just a man. A weak, broken man who had spent years pretending to be more than he was. And now, without his power, without his shield, he had nothing left. As Jamal turned to leave, he heard Darren's voice again, lower this time, almost too quiet to catch. "You're still a nobody." Jamal stopped, but he didn't turn back. He just let out a slow breath before answering. "Maybe. But at least I'm free." And with that, he walked out, the door closing behind him with a finality that neither of them could deny. Jamal stepped out of the holding area, the heavy metal door shutting behind him with a hollow finality that seemed to vibrate through the air. The hallway stretched out before him, long and empty, the walls lined with dull, flickering fluorescent lights that cast a sterile glow over everything. His footsteps echoed against the polished floor, each step deliberate, measured, though his mind was anything but still. He was walking away, putting distance between himself and the man who had once held power over his entire future, but the weight pressing down on his chest refused to lift. It wasn't that he expected this moment to feel like a victory, he had stopped believing in easy victories a long time ago. It was something deeper, something more complicated. He had faced Darren Calloway not as a victim, not as a man begging for justice, but as an equal. And now that it was done, now that Calloway was nothing more than another prisoner awaiting his fate, Jamal felt empty. He had spent months bracing for the worst, preparing himself for the possibility that his life as he knew it would be taken from him, that he would be swallowed whole by a system that had devoured so many before him. And now, here he was, on the other side of it, standing in a moment he had never let himself imagine. Free. But the question that burned in the back of his mind, the one that refused to go away no matter how hard he tried to shake it, was what now? What did he do with this? What came after survival? The hallway opened up into the main corridor of the courthouse, where the atmosphere was completely different from the quiet emptiness he had just left behind. Outside the large double doors, the press had gathered, their voices a constant hum of anticipation, their cameras flashing in rapid succession, capturing every movement, every expression. The case had become bigger than him, he knew that. It had become a symbol, a statement, a reckoning that no one had seen coming. Darren Calloway, the man who had once been untouchable, had fallen, and the world was watching. Jamal spotted his mother standing near the exit, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, the tension in her shoulders still visible despite the relief that shone in her tired eyes. She had fought for him every step of the way, had stood in spaces that had made her feel powerless, had pleaded with a justice system that rarely had mercy for men like him. And now, here he was, walking toward her, free not because the system had suddenly found its conscience, but because people like her had refused to give up. As he reached her, she immediately reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. "Are you okay?" Her voice was soft, but there was an urgency beneath it, a mother's need to make sure that despite everything, her son was still whole. Jamal let out a slow breath, nodding, though the truth was he wasn't entirely sure. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "I think so." She studied him, searching his face the way only a mother could, trying to see beyond his words. There was something unreadable in his expression, something still unsettled. He could tell she wanted to say more, to press him, to ask him what was weighing on him so heavily, but she didn't. Instead, she just nodded, squeezing his hand once before releasing it. Before they could move toward the exit, a voice called out from behind them. "Jamal." He turned, and his eyes landed on Maya Thompson as she approached. She moved with purpose, her presence commanding in a way that didn't require words. Even after everything, she still carried herself with the same unshaken confidence, the same unwavering focus that had made her the most powerful force in that courtroom. But there was something else in her eyes now, something sharper, something that told him that, to her, this wasn't over. "Agent Thompson," Jamal said, his voice steady, acknowledging her with a small nod. Maya studied him for a long moment, as if she were still piecing something together, still searching for an answer to a question only she knew how to ask. Then, her gaze flickered past him, to the sea of reporters waiting just beyond the doors. "You sure you don't want to say something?" she asked, her tone even, but not without weight. "People are waiting to hear from you." Jamal's jaw tightened slightly, his eyes drifting toward the chaos outside. He could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on him, the unspoken demand for him to step forward and become something more than just a man who had survived. He knew what they wanted from him. They wanted a moment, a quote, a headline that could be plastered across the evening news. They wanted him to stand in front of the cameras and talk about justice, about victory, about what this meant for people like him. But the truth was, he wasn't sure what it meant yet. He wasn't sure if this was justice, or if it was just another small battle in a war that had no end. "I don't have anything to say," he admitted, shaking his head slightly. "At least, nothing they want to hear." Maya didn't look surprised. If anything, there was a flicker of understanding in her eyes, as if she had expected this answer. She nodded, then took a step closer, lowering her voice so that only he could hear. "Calloway's just the beginning," she murmured. "You know that, right?" Jamal's gaze darkened slightly, his hands flexing at his sides. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know." Maya studied him for another long moment, then reached into her pocket, pulling out a small card. She held it out to him, waiting until he took it before speaking again. "If you ever want to talk," she said, her tone softer now, less authoritative. "Or if you ever want to do something more than just walk away, you know where to find me." Jamal stared down at the card in his hand, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. He didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure if he even had an answer yet. Instead, he just nodded, slipping the card into his pocket before looking back at her. "Thanks," he said finally. Maya didn't smile, but there was something in her expression that felt almost like approval. "Take care of yourself, Jamal." And with that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the chaos of the courthouse steps, her presence lingering long after she was gone. Jamal stood there for a moment, staring after her, his mind turning over everything that had happened, everything that was still to come. Then, finally, he turned back to his mother, nodding toward the street. "Let's go home," he said. And for the first time in a long time, those words didn't feel like a question. They felt like a promise. The weeks that followed the trial unfolded like a storm finally settling after months of relentless chaos. The city moved on in the way cities always do, headlines shifted, public outrage found new targets, and the name Darren Calloway slowly faded from the front pages. But for the people who had lived through it, for the ones whose lives had been shaped by the weight of injustice, the echoes of what had happened remained. Jamal Carter walked through the streets of his neighborhood with a quiet sense of awareness, his footsteps familiar on sidewalks he had once feared would never feel like home again. Everything looked the same, the corner store with the flickering sign, the old basketball court with the net barely hanging on, the row of brownstones where kids still played on the stoops. But he wasn't the same. People noticed him now, nodded when he passed, stopped him in grocery stores, on sidewalks, outside barber shops. Some recognized him from the news, from the trial, from the case that had shaken the city's faith in the system. Others knew him from before, from the boy he had been before all of this, before his name had been tangled in a courtroom battle that almost stole his future. His mother watched him differently now, not with fear, not with that constant tightness in her face like she was bracing for something awful, but with something closer to relief. She didn't say much about it, didn't ask him how he was feeling, didn't press him to talk about what came next. She just made sure there was always food on the stove, always space for him to sit, always a quiet understanding in the way she reached for his hand when she passed him in the kitchen. That was enough for now. Maya Thompson hadn't disappeared. If anything, she was everywhere. Her name had been attached to Calloway's downfall, and though she hadn't sought out the attention, it had found her anyway. More officers were being investigated, new files were surfacing, cases she had spent years trying to break open were finally seeing daylight. She moved through it all with the same unshaken resolve, taking meetings, speaking at hearings, refusing to let people forget what had happened, refusing to let it be just another headline that faded into history. She hadn't expected Jamal to call her, hadn't expected him to reach out after everything was over, but one afternoon, as she sat in her office, staring at stacks of reports that all carried the same thread of corruption, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She answered, already knowing who it was before he spoke. Jamal's voice was steady, but there was something new in it, something that hadn't been there before. "You still serious about what you said? About doing something more than just walking away?" Maya smiled to herself, leaning back in her chair, already knowing that this was just the beginning. "Yeah," she said, her voice calm, certain. "I meant every word." Darren Calloway was sitting in a prison cell, the walls around him closing in, the reality of his new existence sinking into every breath he took. The trial had been only the beginning of his fall. More charges followed, civil rights violations, perjury, conspiracy. Officers who once worked alongside him had turned, cutting deals, exposing every piece of his corruption in exchange for leniency. He had spent years believing himself invincible, believing that the system he had manipulated so well would always protect him. Now, that system had chewed him up and spit him out. His power was gone, his name reduced to whispers of disgrace, his future nothing more than a cold, hard reality of time spent locked away. And the worst part? No one had come to save him. No one had reached out to defend him. The same people who had once stood by his side had disappeared the moment he became a liability. He had thought himself untouchable. Now, he was nothing. Jamal stood outside a community center, staring at the sign that had been there for as long as he could remember, the same place where kids from the neighborhood came to play ball, to study, to find something to keep them off the streets. He had walked past this place 1,000 times, never really seeing it, never thinking about what it meant. But today, as he pushed the door open, he saw it differently. The room inside was filled with young faces, kids with the same wary looks he had once worn, kids who had already been taught, in quiet, unspoken ways, that the world wasn't made for them. He stepped inside, the noise of laughter and conversations washing over him, and for the first time in months, he felt something settle inside him. The past couldn't be undone. The scars left by the system, by men like Darren Calloway, wouldn't just disappear. But maybe, just maybe, something good could come from all of it. Because survival wasn't enough. Walking away wasn't enough. Something had to change. And maybe, for the first time, he finally knew where to start. How many times have we seen this story play out? How many times have names been added to the long list of those who never got to see justice? The truth is, for every case like Jamal Carter's, there are hundreds more that never make it to trial, hundreds more that never see the light of day. But this story isn't just about one man. It's about the fight that continues long after the cameras stop flashing, long after the headlines move on. What would you have done if you were Jamal? If you had been stripped of your freedom, your future hanging in the balance, knowing that the system wasn't built to protect you? What choices would you have made? And more importantly, what happens now? The fight for justice doesn't end when one corrupt cop goes to prison. It doesn't end when one person finds freedom. It continues in every courtroom, every city, every community that refuses to be silenced. So tell me, what did this story make you feel? What would you have done in Jamal's place? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, real stories, powerful stories, stories that make you think, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Hit that like button, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for the next story that will leave you speechless. Because justice isn't just a moment. It's a movement. And this? This is just the beginning.